My guest today is Sean Fraser, the Federal Security Officer at Okta. Sean, thanks so much for taking the time. Always great to catch up.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jason. Always good to see you.
As part of our Zero Trust Exchange, we are focusing on different pillars around Zero Trust. And of course, when we talk to Okta, we have to focus on identity and access management. Pillar number one of Zero Trust, the maturity model that CISA put out, obviously very important also in areas of NSA and DoD's maturity model. So let's just start at the beginning. We've been talking about identity and access management. It feels like 20 plus years now. What, from your perspective, is the state of IDAM today, and how has that Zero Trust strategy / memo that OMB put out really changed the conversation over the last year?
So I think it's no accident that the identity is the first pillar of Zero Trust. If you think about where we are functionally with regards to attackers who are trying to get access to systems, a lot of the low-hanging fruit ends up living in our identity systems. So it's one of the first things we got to shore up and protect. And we have been doing identity for a while, but I would say that we haven't really been focused on it as security and or critical infrastructure. We've been more focused on it as a capability to get into something versus how do we think about it being leveraging to protect data and preventing people to get into something. So that concept has changed. So it's really evolving, and we're in kind of an interesting time with ICAM or IDAM or identity and access management or whatever you want to call it, in that we're looking at this through the security lens. We're looking at ways to leverage that memo guidance with regards to, hey, do secure single sign-on. Take your 60 different identity systems, bring them into one system where you can have better control and better fidelity and better user experiences. And then leveraging some of the other things like phishing-proof factors for multi-factor authentication, also called out in the guidance. So make strong authentication, make it so that the right user is getting access to the right data at the right time. And we've also seen this being leveraged not only just from the Zero Trust security model, but also as a way to kind of modernize identity to match what we're doing on the digital services side. So if you think about applications and modernizing applications, this is the natural kind of peas and carrots security construct to this. So the Zero Trust security construct or an identity really is made for this day where we live in, where it's cloud access to data, anywhere, anytime access.
A couple of things I just want to kind of take a half a step back. I think folks may listen to what you just said and say, okay, hold on. We've been doing identity for 20 years, but we haven't been focused on security and critical infrastructure, as you said. Let's pull that string on that a little bit, because I think when we go back to really the beginning of the identity effort, and whether we start in 2000, late 90s with the DoD Common Access Card, or if we go to 2004, 2005 and HSPD 12, that was all related to security and this idea of protecting. What's the difference you're making now? When you talk about it's maybe hasn't been as focused, is more focused on getting into a system versus the overall security? So
I think certainly the smart cards, and that was the technology we had at the time. So that was the thing that we could use to leverage to log into our systems. And at the time we did that, a lot of our systems were on-prem. So we're logging into VPNs, we're getting into networks. Since then, we've had a lot of adoption on cloud. So basically the workloads have changed. The workloads are now in the cloud, access from anywhere. We've had a lot of change on the endpoint side, so mobility. So anyone who's tried to use a CAC or a PIV with a mobile device realizes the challenges around that. And so we've had some, what I would consider a little bit of stopgap measurement with derived credentials, where we kind of said, okay, we're going to take a soft cert approach and kind of mirror what a smart card does, put it in software on a device. But it still doesn't have that kind of great user experience, right? It's still kind of a challenge for enrollment. It's a challenge for identity proofing. It's a challenge for users to use. It kind of lives on this device over here. What if I'm using this device over there? So it's still got its kind of usability challenges. So what we're finding now is that the identity access management that we're seeing currently is really lending itself better to the world we find ourselves in, the mobile world, the cloud world. So if you're used to using Touch ID and Face ID to pay at Starbucks, or to do any kind of e-commerce on your mobile device, you're leveraging those same open standards in the enterprise to give you the same phishing resistant capability, the same security capability, and also kind of future-proof you, because all the new applications coming out are all going to adopt into this new model, not adopt into the old model.
And I think that's the key piece, and we'll get to that in a little bit, the adopting into the old model, it's not going to work, because we're going to move forward. I want to jump back around to that Zero Trust strategy, the memo that put out. It calls for several advancements. You mentioned the single sign-on, you mentioned multi-factor authentication. What are you seeing from your agency customers? What are they asking you about? What are some of those trends?
So I think the challenge initially for Zero Trust was, if you look at it through the lens of yet another thing I have to do. And I think one of the other challenges too, and a lot of people have fatigue about unfunded mandates, right? No one's giving me any extra money to do this, but yet you're telling me I got to do all this extra stuff. I think it's important for agencies and anyone to look at this and think about it as a way to help simplify, not add complexity. So you can look at your environment and kind of take a best of breed kind of community approach inside your agency or organization and figure out, okay, well, where are the areas where I can leverage things I've already got that fit into this model? And I think that the NSA documentation that came out last year around Zero Trust was really prescient and one of the most important things, because it basically called it kind of a lifestyle choice. It called it something where you're going to change your behavior around security. It's not so much focused on the products or even necessarily the capabilities. It's more about changing your mindset around security. And I think if you do that and adopt that more holistic approach to security, you have opportunities to, again, simplify, not add complexity. Whereas if you look at it the other way, where we've looked at security for the last 20 years, is we're just layering one more thing on top of 10 other things that we've got to manage.
The unfunded mandate has come up quite a bit. Earlier in the day, we heard from Chris DeRusha, the Federal Chief Information Security Officer, and he talked a lot about the funding issue. And one of the things he brought up was this idea that agencies have been planning for quite a while. We don't think they have, but there's been the 22 budget had some zero trust. 23 budget has some zero trust, and they're planning the 24 budget as well. Is that, when you talk to your agency customers, do they feel like that the funding issue is still the biggest impediment, or is it that, I think you said the lifestyle choice change, is that getting their mind around that, or you're going to tell me both?
Yeah, I'm going to say it's all the above, right? Because it's going to be, part of it is, I think there's not that clear understanding of where do I get the funds to do all these different things. And sometimes you can look at the TMF, the Modernization Fund, and say, okay, well, I can maybe leverage that to kind of start my investigation to figure out how to do zero trust. But I think it's also partially a cultural shift, right? It's changing that mindset, changing kind of your muscle memory around security internally. And you've got kind of a couple dimensions of culture you've got to work through. You've got the kind of the dyed-in-the-wool security culture that thinks about things in terms of kind of castle and moat security. Thinks about things all about network security. They think about VPNs. They think about kind of intrusion detection, intrusion prevention, and these kinds of things. And you have to kind of unwind that mindset and think about things differently, because we're fast approaching an era we live in where the network is going to become less and less relevant. And nothing was more kind of put into sharp relief than during the pandemic, where everyone was kind of teleworking from home immediately, instantly. And all of a sudden, you had to do all the same things in completely different networks, right? So everyone kind of struggled to figure out, well, how do I collaborate? How do I get access to my data? How do I do all these different things? And we all did a pretty good job. We actually made it through that. Everyone got access to the things they needed to get to. We stood up technologies that allowed us to collaborate. And it turns out we're all on different networks. We're all on Verizon and AT&T or in a coffee shop or at home or wherever we were, and we still were able to do all those things. So what Zero Trust forces you to do is think about the access regardless of location. So wherever that data is, wherever that user is, the same constructs have to exist. It doesn't matter whether you're on the home network or whether you're in Starbucks or sitting in a movie theater accessing your data. The location really becomes irrelevant.
You mentioned this idea, and I want to go back to the money issue as well, but you mentioned this idea of single sign-on, and we did a panel recently where we heard CISA, not the CISA we think of as cybersecurity, but actually the internal part of CISA, having something to the effect of 20 different single sign-on, or some way to kind of get onto different applications in many different ways, very disparate, not all connected. That's a place potentially to find some money for Zero Trust or for some of these initiatives. Hey, if I don't have to pay for 10 of these or 20 of them, I can pay for one that is enterprise-wide. Is that something that you're hearing from agencies and trying to help them understand, hey, here's X amount of millions of dollars that potentially you could use?
Yeah, we're hearing that not just from agencies, but also commercial customers as well. Because if you've been around for more than 10 years, you've got a long tail legacy of technologies, and a lot of times the identity and access management solutions were just a means to an end to access data. So whenever you bought an application, you got one of those for free. So next thing you know, you turn around, you got 60 of them. And 60 is not an exaggeration. I talk to agencies all the time that have 60 different identity and access management solutions, and they've cobbled them together and kind of tied them together as best they could. But you're exactly right. There's a lot of expense in managing all those. There's a lot of expense in figuring out how to tie all those things together. And if you can take this opportunity to simplify, and again, per the guidance, move to secure single sign-on to one kind of service delivery model of identity, that is a way to pay for some of these things.
That discussion's difficult, though, or at least it seems to be difficult, because you're asking, or what agencies have to do is give up something that they're used to, they're comfortable with. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, they understand the value of these enterprise capabilities. Every CIO I talk to, every CISO I talk to talks about, I'm trying to deliver something as a service. Is that where identity is going next when you talk about zero trust and the future of identity? Is it around the as a service model?
Absolutely. I mean,
well, for Okta it is, we know that. But
I was going to say, you think about what we do for a living, that's exactly what it is. It's identity, cloud-based identity as a service. Right. And I don't see agencies treating this any differently. It's if you look at any kind of IT infrastructure, and that's kind of what this is, IT critical infrastructure, you deliver it as a service. And the challenge that we've had, if you look at any kind of data breach report, Verizon just released one recently, they do one every year, and almost inevitably the top hits of data breaches are always around credentials, phishing, identity. And the reason is because we have these complex systems, and there might be a system that's running out in your environment you don't even know about that's kind of wide open and doesn't have multi-factor, and someone can kind of come in there, and if you're not adopting the zero trust mindset, there's a couple areas where that can bite you. One is in the ingress into your environment, but the other is in the lateral movement. Because one of the things about zero trust security is it's kind of least privilege, deny by default behavior that you need to adopt in your environment. So even if you do have that kind of hanging thing that's out there that you didn't know about that someone logs into, they can't really get from there to somewhere else to cause damage. So you got to do both of those things.
And the key piece to this as a service mindset, to changing the culture, is in many ways something you've talked quite a bit about, which is this idea of open standards and interoperability. Because agencies are going to live in the hybrid world. They're going to have some stuff in the cloud, applications, data in the cloud, some stuff on-prem. So you need the ability to kind of move back and forth. And the legacy technical debt's going to be around for a while. Maybe help explain why open standards really does matter in this world.
So I'm a true believer in open standards. I think open standards are completely critical. And not to date myself, but I worked at a company called Netscape where we kind of defined a lot of the standards of the internet. And we did that for a reason. And we did that for collaboration so that all the products would work together. And at the end of the day, if you look at a company like Okta, where we're kind of built on these identity standards, so we're built on things like SAML, OpenIDC, we're built on things like WebAuthn, which is a FIDO2 standard. The reason why we build these things in is because we want to be able to provide capabilities and compete on those capabilities. We don't want to compete on the fact that we've locked someone into something. So 5 years from now, if someone decides there's a better mousetrap and they can do all the same things we do but better, those open standards allow that agency that flexibility. So and from the flip side of that, it also allows the ecosystem to thrive. So one of the things about zero trust is it's not a one vendor solution. It's not one vendor can sell you anything around zero trust. We all participate in this together. So the open standards allow us to work together to deliver this capability across all 5 pillars.
You mentioned FIDO, SAML. Do you think there's a better understanding among agencies of what these are and why they're important? We've been hearing about SAML for quite a number of years, but it seems like there's a different view of what it is and why it's important.
I think that folks are really understanding it much better now. Yeah, we have been talking about it. It's one of those things that these things just take time to kind of organically move through the environments and for people to understand them. And obviously, the more we get into the cloud space, the more we kind of think of the mobile endpoints being different, the more federation becomes important. The more you kind of think about, okay, well, if you're the owner of those entities, you own those entities, and I can federate to you, and I can do that over a secure channel. Because the alternative to that is I stand up the exact same records that you do in a database. And I've got all these databases flying around with users and entities that need to access things. And again, that's just a target for attackers. So if you consolidate that into a secure model that people can communicate with, then you've reduced your kind of footprint to attackers and your blast surface.
It also addresses the complexity issue of not just managing it and securing it, but then of how to apply that data or how to use that data to drive decisions, to serve citizens, to meet your internal customers. It seems that, as you said, zero trust seems to add more complexity, but in fact, it's reducing complexity in many ways. Is that a good example?
Yeah, it's a great example because it's absolutely true. And I think one of the things that it actually does is it aligns itself well to the model of the cloud and the internet, which is all kind of API based. And if you think about identity as a service being API based and being accessible, that's exactly the model that the cloud kind of brings you. And that's the benefit of having this interconnected network that we're all connected to every single day anyway. Whereas if you have these kind of silos of data, it increases complexity, and the only beneficiary of complexity is attackers, never the users. And you have an opportunity to kind of reduce that complexity by focusing on the most important things. And the other thing that does is that lays the foundation of the most important thing in zero trust, which is focus on the data.
You said earlier as well, and I want to go back to the open standards discussion, you talked about future proofing, and I think this is a key piece here because as we know, as we've seen, as you and I have seen over the last 20 years, where identity was in 2000 is not where it was in 2005, it's not where it was in 2010, and here we are 2022, it's not where it is. And 5 more years from now, it's going to be different. So how does the use of open standards, how does the use of this idea of interoperability ensure that agencies can continue to evolve as identity and access management technologies and capabilities evolve?
It's the same answer that I would have said back in 1995 when we were talking about open standards back then, is that it allows you the ability to plug and play. So as new technologies come out, you're already wired in to be able to adopt that technology. You've already kind of built the infrastructure for that. So as whatever those standards are, you're kind of ready as they come. A good example is you look at how the platforms have changed over time. You look at 20 years ago, we were kind of in a Windows desktop world. Now we're not in that world. We're pretty much in a heterogeneous world where we've got, Chrome OS, we've got iOS, we've got Mac OS, we've got Windows OS. But by adopting those standards, if you look at specifically at FIDO2 and WebAuthn, that standard is adopted across those platforms, leveraging their capabilities. So Windows calls it Windows Hello, Apple calls it Touch ID, Face ID, they're called different things, but they're done the exact same way. They're wired into Okta the exact same way. So that means you give choice. Your users can say, yeah, I'm a Windows guy, I'm gonna do Windows, or I'm an iOS gal, I'm gonna do iOS, right? So you give your users the choice, which fundamentally also funnels into the grand unspoken thing about this, which is providing the best user experiences possible.
I'm glad you brought up user experience, because that's exactly where we want to go next, because I think that's the other key piece to this. If you make it so complex and so hard and Zero Trust really shuts down everything, you're going to piss off the users. The users are then going to find your way around it. They always have, they always will, no matter how great you are, or hey Sean, give me the data because I can't get to it. Okay, here it is. And now you've caused a breach of a different kind. So how is the move toward open standards, how's this idea of cloud and the as a service model helping also to ensure there's a good user experience for both the internal customers, agency employees, contractors, and then the external ones like citizens?
So I think the most important thing is, again, tying into those functionalities that users live with every single day in their personal lives. So I talked about some of the ones, Touch ID and Face ID, paying for Starbucks using Face ID in a mobile app, using your mobile phone. Those are things that folks just know intrinsically in their personal lives. So if they showed up to work one day and they log into the systems using the exact same technologies, then it's seamless for them. You don't have to teach them anything new. They've already kind of adopted this and know this. And the world we're living in now, kids coming out of school, they just intrinsically know how to use all these technologies. So they're already kind of prepared to come into the workforce and be able to do these things. Whereas if we have different things, we build special things in the workforce and we build special things for our enterprise, then there's the whole learning curve. And we're not necessarily any more secure, because it's one of those things where open standards, because there's such a bright light shining on it, it behooves all the technology companies that work with it to make it secure. We do this for a reason. Versus, I built a special thing and it's security through obscurity. I'm not telling anyone how it works, and that therefore it's secure. And we know that's not ever true.
When you talk about the user experience, the other side of the coin, of course, is our agencies. You mentioned the ability to digitally transform, and identity playing a key role in it. And we know, for instance, we've seen the Veterans Affairs Department talk a lot about how to make it easier for veterans to access health care. We hear a lot from the General Services Administration. Is that the other part of the conversation you're having with a lot of agencies about, okay, how do you help that user, citizen, customer experience?
Absolutely. So, and I think one of the most important things is giving people access to that data. I think the VA is a great example where making it as seamless as possible, and don't make the users jump through hoops. Again, back to my point about making it hard for attackers, not hard for users. Making sure that they can, within a couple clicks and maybe even a biometric login, get access to their medical records, get access to the things that are meaningful to them, but have the wherewithal around that system to functionally look at the context of the request to determine if it's a bad request, we shut it down right away. So doing all these things kind of at wire speed as you're making these determinations. So don't get in the way of the user unless you absolutely have to, but get in the way of the attacker. So if anything looks kind of funky with the request that's coming in, it doesn't look like the behavior that user normally exhibits, it's a new device, it's a new location, then I can start layering on friction. But until I see those things happen, don't layer on the friction, just seamlessly let those folks in.
Yeah, I think we heard just recently on the panel I referred to earlier, someone said I think maybe it was you even, make the friction, the attacker feel the friction, not the user. So I think it's a good rule of thumb. We talked a lot about kind of all these great things that are happening, but for a lot of agencies, there's still a struggle. Yes, they have a PIV card. Yes, they have a CAT card. Yes, they have single sign-on in some places and multiple sign-ons in others. And there's some multi-factor authentication. There's not all multi-factor. Or where is the big area that you see agencies are struggling? Where do you see, what kind of questions are you getting? Hey, can you help us do what? Where are those areas?
So I think some of the biggest things are, again, helping on the consolidation and helping on kind of the journey of what this looks like, because you're exactly right. And I always talk about the fact that there's a lot of zero trusty things in your organization anyway, and or already. So if you think about CAC and PIV, if you're using those, obviously those are called out specifically in 2209 about being phishing resistant factors. That's awesome, use those. But there are use cases where they don't necessarily exist or they can't exist. So if you're talking about kind of military working with families or working with retirees and working with other use cases or folks who are outside of kind of the enlisted or outside of the current folks who are actually in the military, you don't typically have smart cards in those environments, and even if you did, it would be really cumbersome to try to manage those and manage kind of the onboarding and offboarding of all those different things because there's just so many moving parts to it. So figuring out, well, where can I augment what I'm doing with smart cards today and what use cases those might be, and those, again, tend to be the edge use cases. They tend to be environments where maybe I'm dealing with citizen services, I'm dealing directly with citizens where I don't want to be, give them the burden of having to manage a card or keep track of a card. And helping them kind of make the next step in the journey. Because eventually at some point, those smart cards aren't going to be around anymore, right? They're not going to live forever. We have to prepare ourselves for that fact. So if you kind of build and think about, WebAuthn, which is basically, it's a similar PKI construct, not to get too deep in the weeds, but it's similar PKI construct as the smart card architecture. It's just more elegant user experience on the top. So if we kind of prepare our eye towards where do we go after CAC and PIV? That's what we should start thinking about now, because even though it's 5 or 10 years down the road, that happens before you know it.
How many agencies, from your perspective, are kind of moving in that direction, the FIDO2 web authentication, or are they still kind of, because of the systems and the legacy and the legacy technical debt, kind of stuck in this hard token PKI, got to have your card?
We're still early days, so we're still talking about it. There's still some standard work around 863 that has to be revved, and if you think about 863, Rev 3 has been out 5 or 6 years now, so it's a little while. So we got to re-rev that for the current state we live in today. But the good news is we are talking about it. So when I have conversations with government customers and clients and partners and folks who are looking at kind of building out infrastructure and planning for the future, this is always part of that conversation.
I know you're focused on the federal area, but let me just maybe ask you, maybe take a half a step back and say, how does the government comparing these days to the private sector? A lot of people that I've talked to said, well, that zero trust memo really laid great groundwork for the entire private public sector. Are you finding that a lot of the private sector, when Okta works with your clients over there, are in the same spot as agencies? A lot of different authentication approaches, trying to get enterprise services? Are they a little ahead? Where do you find them?
So I would say that we are all in the same boat. Most conversations I have with large enterprise organization, and I was just in Atlanta last week having a conversation with a private organization, same challenges, right? It's the same cultural challenges. It's the same adoption, questions around how do I do this? Where am I now, right? Part of the first thing with the zero trust maturity model that CISA called out really well was kind of figure out where you are now. Take a little time to kind of look at your environment, figure out where you plug in, take that community approach, work with your business owners, build security in from the ground up, right? These are all the things that the CISA talks about, I talk about all the time. So we're still kind of in the, I need to figure out where we are now and where do I go from here phase. There are some, the light, the bright shining light for folks who have kind of done this, and there are some. You look at good examples would be some OIGs within federal government who are a little more smaller and nimble who have really embarked on this and taken it on. Same thing with smaller organizations, and I consider Okta being a smaller organization a little bit, but we're kind of born on the cloud. We live zero trust. So there are organizations like us that live in the world that kind of intrinsically understand this because we kind of always lived this way. But I think that's still got to bleed out to larger organizations who all have the same concerns.
OMB has said many times agencies are on this journey. It's not going to happen evenly. Your agency is not going to get there at the same time as my agency. There's a set of goals, a set of objectives that everyone kind of has. To meet the big objective around single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, you mentioned you got to know where you are today. So what comes after that? What's your roadmap? What are you seeing from agencies in terms of developing that roadmap of saying, okay, once we figure out our as is, how do we get to our 2B?
So I have some bad news for folks. It is a journey, but it's a journey that never ends, right? So if you think about zero trust building in, and I always call it like a lifestyle change, and it's almost like, if you have a workout regimen you do for your personal life, you don't say, well, I'm going to stop working out on July 1st. At that point, I'm done. I never need to work out again.
I do, by the way. Yeah, I'm tired.
You're a lucky man. You're a lucky man. The rest of us are not that lucky. So it's one of those things where you've got to build in for the long haul. So you got to stop and kind of take stock of where you are, figure out where you are and where you start. It's never going to end, but you're all going to get to the point where you've got identity and access management covered, you've got multi-factor authentication, and the highest percentage you can get in coverage. I mean, right now, unfortunately, the percentages in most enterprises are way too low. But if you get like 90, 95% coverage, you're in a really good spot. But again, the word of the day is continuous. You're going to continually look at this as you bring in and ingest new applications, as you bring in new technologies, as you bring in new users, as Apple and Microsoft and Google change in their world, all those things have to be ingested. So you have to plan for all of that.
I think that's a great point, and that's where actually we're going to leave this. You've got to build for the long haul. You're never done, but you're going to make incremental progress to really make things better. And yes, today you're at X amount of percentage, tomorrow you're at the next percentage, and you keep building and building and building. And I think that's really the key message I would offer from our conversation.
Completely agree. And pick good partners to help you out.
Oh, of course. I mean, don't pick bad partners. Sean, unfortunately, we are out of time for today, so let me thank my guest. Sean Frazier is the Federal Chief Security Officer at Okta. Sean, always a pleasure.
Yes, thanks, Jason. Good to see you.
I'm Jason Miller. Now let me send you back to the studio for more from the Zero Trust Cyber Exchange.